High in the Bavarian Alps, on a razor-thin ridge 6,200 feet above sea level, a small stone building still looks out over the mountains of Austria and Germany the way it has for nearly 90 years. Tourists ride a brass-lined elevator up through solid rock to reach it. They order beer and sausages on its terrace and take photographs of the same view that once belonged to Adolf Hitler. This building has a name that has become infamous around the world: the Eagle's Nest. It was built by the Nazi Party at staggering expense, using thousands of laborers working around the clock through brutal alpine winters, and it was meant to be the ultimate symbol of Hitler's power, a fortress in the clouds that no enemy could ever reach. And yet, when American and French soldiers finally did reach it in May of 1945, they found something almost absurd. The Great Führer had barely used it at all. So how did this monument to Nazi grandeur survive the war completely intact when nearly everything around it was reduced to rubble? Why did the Allies and later the German government itself choose not to destroy it when they demolished almost every other building connected to Hitler in the surrounding area? And what exactly happens inside Hitler's mountain retreat today, 80 years after the swastika flag was hauled down from its roof? In this video we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. The story of the Eagle's Nest cannot be told without first understanding the strange transformation of the mountainside where it stands. The area is called Obersalzberg, a stretch of alpine meadow and forest above the small market town of Berchtesgaden, close to the border with Austria. For centuries, it had been nothing more than a quiet farming community, dotted with wooden guest houses and known mostly to hikers and health tourists who came for the clean mountain air. Adolf Hitler first visited the region in 1923, staying at a modest hotel called the Platterhof, while he worked on ideas that would later form the core of his political worldview. He was drawn back again and again by the dramatic scenery and the relative isolation, and in 1928 he rented a small chalet called Haus Wachenfeld, a modest wooden building with none of the grandeur that would later define the site. 5 years later, flush with royalties from the sales of Mein Kampf and newly installed as Chancellor of Germany, Hitler purchased the property outright. Over the following 3 years, he poured money and effort into transforming the humble chalet into something else entirely. Window shutters and a small office were added first, then a winter garden and new stonework, and finally, between 1935 and 1936, an enormous expansion that included a colossal picture window that could be lowered into the wall to open the Great Hall to the mountain air. The modest farmhouse had become the Berghof, Hitler's second seat of power outside Berlin, a place where he would eventually spend nearly a third of his time as Führer, hosting foreign dignitaries, issuing orders, and making decisions that would shape the fate of millions. As Hitler expanded his own home, his inner circle followed him up the mountain. Hermann Göring built a residence nearby. So did Martin Bormann, the increasingly powerful head of the party chancellery, who controlled access to Hitler more tightly than almost anyone else in the regime. Albert Speer acquired a house as well. Bormann, who had appointed himself the chief administrator of the entire district, began systematically buying out or evicting the original residents of Obersalzberg, clearing the mountainside of ordinary farmers and villagers to make way for a fortified enclave reserved exclusively for the Nazi elite. By the mid-1930s, the area had been sealed off entirely, transformed into what the regime called the Führersperrgebiet, or Führer's Restricted Zone, a security cordon of over 100 hectares patrolled by a dedicated contingent of the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler under the command of Obersturmbannführer Bernhard Frank. Ordinary Germans could no longer wander the meadows their families had farmed for generations. In their place rose barracks, greenhouses, a private cinema, a school for the children of the Nazi elite, and an underground shooting range. The Berghof itself became something of a tourist attraction in the mid-1930s, with visitors flocking to catch a glimpse of the Führer until the security restrictions eventually closed off public access almost entirely. It was into this atmosphere of expanding grandeur and creeping paranoia that Martin Bormann conceived his most audacious project yet. In the summer of 1937, he decided that the crowning achievement of the Obersalzberg complex would be a building unlike anything else in the Reich, a reception house perched not merely on the mountainside but on the very summit of the Kehlstein, a rocky sub-peak of the Hoher Gull that towered more than 1,800 meters above sea level. Bormann's official justification was that the structure would serve as a diplomatic reception house, a place where Hitler could entertain visiting statesmen against a backdrop so dramatic it would leave them awestruck and, perhaps, more pliable at the negotiating table. Unofficially, many historians believe Bormann intended the project as a grand 50th birthday gift for Hitler, whose 50th birthday would fall on April 20th, 1939. Whatever the precise motivation, the scale of the undertaking was almost unimaginable. Nothing like it had ever been built at such an altitude, on such difficult terrain, in such a short amount of time. Construction began on August 27, 1937. Bormann, characteristically obsessive about every detail of his projects, kept a daily log tracking the progress of the work and personally visited the site with striking frequency, often clashing with engineers over decisions both large and small. The scale of labour mobilised for the project was immense. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 2,500 and 6,000 workers were involved across the full scope of the Obersalzberg expansion, with a substantial contingent dedicated specifically to the Kehlstein road and building. Early in the project, the workforce was composed mostly of German, Austrian and Italian labourers, employed by major construction firms such as the Frankfurt-based company Polensky und Söllner, and these men were reportedly paid well for their efforts. But as 1938 approached and Germany's war preparations accelerated, the composition of the workforce began to shift, with increasing numbers of Czech and, later, Polish labourers filling gaps left by workers pulled toward other Reich construction priorities. Conditions for these later arrivals were markedly harsher, with lower wages, meagre rations, and grueling stretches away from home in the brutal alpine climate. The centrepiece of the project was the access road, a masterpiece of engineering that even today draws admiration from civil engineers who study it. Blasted directly out of the granite mountainside, the road stretched 6.5 kilometres from the base near Obersalzberg to a tunnel entrance just below the summit, climbing roughly 800 metres in elevation along the way. The road was carved through 5 separate tunnels and included only a single hairpin turn, an extraordinary feat of alpine road design for the era. It was built 4 metres wide, just enough for the heavy vehicles that would eventually need to use it, and equipped with telephone connection points at regular intervals to keep the isolated summit in constant contact with the valley below. Work never stopped, not even during the ferocious winter of 1937 to 1938, when temperatures plunged and avalanches threatened the exposed work crews. Bormann insisted the project continue around the clock regardless of season, and so the mountainside was lit at night by searchlights and gas lamps so that labourers could keep working through the darkness. The human cost of this relentless pace was significant. At least 12 workers are documented to have died during the construction of the elevator shaft alone, killed in accidents on the exposed granite face and in the tunnels bored deep into the mountain, with additional deaths recorded across the broader road and building project. 2 serious lightning strikes hit the construction site during the build, incidents that Bormann reportedly went to considerable lengths to keep quiet, perhaps aware of how such omens might play with a superstitious Führer. At the end of the access road, engineers carved a tunnel 406 feet, or roughly 124 metres, straight into the heart of the mountain, guarded by heavy wooden gates at its entrance. From the far end of this tunnel, visitors would step into an elevator unlike any other in Germany, a shaft bored vertically through solid rock that carried passengers the final 124 metres up to the building itself. The elevator car was finished with polished brass fittings, ornate Venetian mirrors, and green leather upholstery, a small pocket of opulence buried inside a mountain. Remarkably, this same elevator remains in daily use today, carrying tourists on the same vertical journey that once carried Hitler and his guests. Above the elevator shaft on the exposed summit ridge, the building itself took shape as a chalet-style structure that from the outside appeared almost humble compared to the engineering marvel that supported it. Inside, however, no expense had been spared. The main reception room was dominated by an enormous fireplace built from red Italian marble, a personal gift from Benito Mussolini intended to symbolize the alliance between the two fascist powers. Additional false marble, quarried from the nearby Untersberg mountain, was used throughout the interior to create an impression of even greater luxury than the true materials alone could provide. Much of the furniture was designed by the architect and interior designer Paul Laszlo, giving the interiors a sleek, modern quality that stood in contrast to the rugged alpine exterior. The building included a dining room, a working office, a drawing room, guest quarters for security personnel, a kitchen, and an expansive basement level. Notably, despite the enormous investment poured into the project, no bedrooms were ever installed. Space on the narrow granite ridge was simply too limited, and in any case, the building was never intended as a place where Hitler or his guests would actually sleep. Food served at the house was not even cooked on site in any meaningful sense. The small kitchen existing mainly to reheat dishes prepared down at the Berghof's own kitchens and carried up the mountain. By October of 1938, after roughly 13 months of round-the-clock labour, the extraordinary project was substantially complete. When all is said and done, historians estimate the total cost of the road and building at around 30 million Reichsmarks, a staggering sum for the era that would translate to well over 100 million euros in today's money. Hitler made his first visit to inspect the finished structure on September 16, 1938, arriving to see firsthand the results of Bormann's obsessive labours. He returned on his 50th birthday, April 20th, 1939, for what is often described as the building's formal inauguration, though the structure was in truth already functioning well before that ceremonial date. The Germans themselves rarely called it the Eagle's Nest. Officially, it was the Kehlstein House, simply the house on the Kehlstein, though internally it was sometimes referred to as the D House, short for Diplomatenhaus, or Diplomat's House, reflecting its intended function as a place to receive and impress foreign visitors. The now famous English nickname came from an unlikely source, the departing French ambassador André-François Poncet, who was received at the summit in a rare diplomatic engagement on October 18, 1938. Struck by the building's dramatic, almost mythical perch atop the mountain, François Poncet described the experience in the French press using imagery evocative of an eagle's eyrie. And the phrase Eagle's Nest stuck, eventually becoming the name by which the building would be known across the English-speaking world for the rest of its existence, whether Germans themselves used it or not. What makes the story of the Eagle's Nest so strange, though, is what happened after all that money, labour and engineering brilliance had been poured into the mountaintop. Adolf Hitler, the man for whom this monument had ostensibly been built, turned out to dislike it intensely. He suffered, by numerous accounts, from a fear of heights, and the exposed, windswept ridge of the Kehlstein did nothing to ease this anxiety. He was also deeply uneasy about the elevator itself, repeatedly expressing concern that the metal winch mechanism installed on the building's roof would attract a lightning strike. A fear that seems almost prophetic, given the two lightning incidents that had already struck the site during construction. Incidents Bormann had worked so hard to conceal from him. Whatever the precise psychological roots of his discomfort, the documented record shows that Hitler visited the Eagle's Nest only around 14 times in total between September 1938 and October 1940, and, after that final visit in the autumn of 1940, he apparently never returned to the summit again for the remainder of the war. Compare this to the extraordinary resources expended on the project, the 12 or more workers who lost their lives, the thousands of labourers who toiled through alpine winters, and the picture that emerges is almost darkly comic. A monument to absolute power that the man it was built for found faintly terrifying and, ultimately, largely avoided. If Hitler himself rarely climbed to the summit, that does not mean the Eagle's Nest sat empty and unused. Quite the opposite. The building became something of a private playground for other members of the Nazi elite. Chief among them Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress, who spent far more time at the Kehlstein than Hitler ever did. Braun found in the isolated mountaintop a welcome escape from the tension and formality of the Berghof below, where she was required to remain largely hidden from the German public and from many of the political visitors who came to see Hitler. At the Eagle's Nest she could relax more freely, sunbathing on the terrace, hiking the surrounding ridgelines and hosting small gatherings of friends and family away from prying eyes. Photographs surviving from the period show her in high-heeled shoes climbing the mountain paths, laughing with companions on the terrace, and generally enjoying the summit in a way that contrasts sharply with the grim purposes for which the surrounding Obersalzberg complex existed. Martin Bormann, too, made frequent use of the house he had built, hosting private dinners and receptions for Nazi Party functionaries and channeling much of his considerable ego into maintaining and showing off his creation to visitors. The most famous social event held at the Eagle's Nest came in the summer of 1944, by which point Germany's fortunes in the war had already turned catastrophically for the worse. On June 3, 1944, Eva Braun's younger sister Gretel married SS Obergruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, an ambitious cavalry officer who had worked his way into Hitler's inner circle and would later serve as the SS liaison officer at Führer headquarters. Hitler did not attend the wedding ceremony itself, nor the reception held afterward at the Eagle's Nest, though he did make an appearance at a separate reception held at the Berghof. Guests at the Kehlstein celebration included senior figures of the regime, and photographs from the day show a scene of surreal normalcy, guests toasting and celebrating in the same rooms where, only weeks earlier, the Allies had stormed ashore at Normandy and begun the liberation of Western Europe. Fegelein's story would end in disgrace less than a year later. In the final days of the war, he was discovered attempting to flee Berlin, reportedly found in his apartment in civilian clothes with a large sum of cash and a Swiss passport in his possession, evidence that he intended to abandon his post and the sinking Nazi regime altogether. Hitler, enraged by what he saw as a betrayal from within his own family circle, ordered Fegelein's execution. He was shot in the garden of the Reich Chancellery on April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's own suicide, making him one of the very last victims of Hitler's wrath before the regime collapsed entirely. Other prominent visitors to the Eagle's Nest during its brief window of active use included propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda, who brought their children along on at least one documented visit, the youngsters posing for photographs on the building's sun terrace with the mountains stretching out behind them. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, though his famous meeting with Hitler in September 1938 actually took place at the Berghof rather than the Kehlstein summit, was part of the broader diplomatic theatre that Obersalzberg represented during the tense years of appeasement, when European leaders travelled to Bavaria in a desperate attempt to avert a continental war. That meeting, which took place on September 15, 1938, formed part of the negotiations that led to the Munich Agreement later that month, an agreement that ceded the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Germany, and which Chamberlain infamously described as securing peace for our time, a promise that would prove tragically hollow within less than a year. As the war progressed and turned against Germany, visits to the mountaintop retreat became increasingly rare. Hitler's final appearance at the summit came in October 1940, and from that point onward the building was used only occasionally, primarily by Bormann and Braun. Its role as a diplomatic showpiece rendered almost meaningless as Germany's remaining diplomatic relationships collapsed one by one. Hitler continued to spend substantial time at the Berghof itself throughout the early war years, using it as a secondary command centre where he received military briefings and made decisions affecting the entire war effort. He spent much of early 1944 at Obersalzberg, watching with mounting anxiety as the military situation deteriorated on every front, from the Eastern Front, where the Red Army was pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Germany's own borders, to the looming threat of an Allied invasion in the West. On July 14, 1944, Hitler left Obersalzberg for what would prove to be the final time. He would never again see the mountain retreat that had consumed so much money, so much labour, and so many lives to build. As Allied bombing campaigns intensified across Germany from 1943 onward, the leadership at Obersalzberg grew increasingly nervous about the vulnerability of their mountain sanctuary. Beginning in July 1943, following heavy air raids on nearby Munich, construction began on an extensive underground bunker system beneath the entire Führersperrgebiet complex. This was an entirely separate undertaking from the Kehlstein road and elevator, a sprawling network of tunnels and chambers blasted into the rock beneath the Berghof and the surrounding buildings, intended to provide shelter for Hitler and his closest circle in the event of an air attack. The scale of this second construction project rivaled the original Eagle's Nest effort. By the time the bunker system was finally halted by the war's end, forced labourers, many of them Czech and Italian prisoners compelled to work under harsh conditions, had carved more than 6 kilometres of underground corridors containing over 100 separate rooms. Twice during each gruelling shift, these workers were given a thin, watery soup, delivered underground in metal milk churns so that no time would be lost bringing the labourers back to the surface for their brief meal breaks. The bunker complex included living quarters, communications facilities, and storage rooms, and it would ultimately prove far more significant to the story of Obersalzberg's final days than the Eagle's Nest itself, since it was here, rather than at the mountaintop retreat, that the last defenders of the complex would take shelter as the war finally came crashing down upon them. Above ground, meanwhile, the Nazi leadership took increasingly elaborate measures to try to protect the visible buildings of Obersalzberg from Allied air attack. Extensive anti-aircraft defences were installed throughout the complex, and remarkably, the Germans developed a sophisticated smoke-generating system capable of blanketing the entire mountainside in artificial fog within minutes of an air raid warning, obscuring the buildings from the view of approaching bombers. In early 1944, the roofs and exteriors of the major buildings were elaborately camouflaged, painted and covered with netting designed to make them nearly invisible from the air, disguising the distinctive shapes of the Berghof and its surrounding structures so thoroughly that Allied reconnaissance photographs struggled to make sense of what they were looking at. For a remarkably long time, these measures worked. The Allies had actually considered launching an attack on Obersalzberg on several occasions earlier in the war, but repeatedly decided against it, whether due to the difficulty of the target, competing strategic priorities, or simple uncertainty about exactly what they would be hitting. The only attack to strike anywhere near Berchtesgaden prior to April 1945 came almost by accident, when 8 American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, unable to complete a separate mission over Italy on February 20, 1945, diverted to the area and attacked a train they spotted near the town, encountering heavy anti-aircraft fire in the process. The mission commander, Major John L. Beck, was reportedly not even fully aware of Berchtesgaden's significance at the time. When news of the raid reached the wider public in Allied countries, there was widespread disappointment that Hitler's mountain retreat itself had not been touched. By the spring of 1945, however, Germany's military situation had become utterly hopeless. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east, American, British and French armies were racing across western Germany with little organized resistance left to stop them, and the once mighty Wehrmacht had been reduced to a shattered remnant of its former self. Rumours began to circulate among the Allies and would persist for years afterward, that the Nazi leadership intended to make a final desperate stand in a so-called alpine redoubt, a mythical mountain fortress built around Obersalzberg and the surrounding Bavarian Alps, where fanatical SS units and party loyalists would hold out indefinitely against overwhelming Allied force. Intelligence assessments at the time gave this notion far more credibility than the facts actually warranted, and this belief, combined with a genuine desire to strike a symbolic blow against the heart of Nazi power, would soon set in motion one of the most destructive air raids of the entire war in Europe, a raid aimed squarely at the mountainside that had cost so much money, so much forced labour, and so many lives to build. It is worth pausing here to consider just how strange the Eagle's Nest really was, even among the many grandiose construction projects the Nazi regime undertook during its 12 years in power. This was a government that built entire cities from scratch, that constructed the Autobahn network, that erected massive party rally grounds at Nuremberg, designed to hold hundreds of thousands of spectators at once. Yet even within that context of monumental Nazi architecture, the Kehlstein project stood out for the sheer impracticality of its ambition. Engineers had to solve problems that had never been attempted at this scale in an alpine environment. Boring a vertical elevator shaft through solid granite, carving a road along a cliff face prone to avalanche and rockfall, and doing all of it in roughly a year, a timeline that would be considered extraordinarily aggressive even with modern construction equipment, let alone the machinery available in 1937 and 1938. The fact that the project succeeded at all, arriving substantially on schedule for Hitler's 50th birthday deadline, speaks to the combination of engineering skill, forced urgency, and sheer expendability of human labour that characterised so much of the Third Reich's construction programme. And yet, for all that effort, the building that resulted from it would spend the vast majority of its existence, both during the war and for the 8 decades since, serving purposes almost entirely disconnected from what its creator originally intended. Bormann built a monument to impress and intimidate. History would eventually repurpose it as a beer garden. Understanding this earlier history matters enormously for what comes next, because the fate of the Eagle's Nest cannot be separated from the fate of the broader Obersalzberg complex that surrounded it. The Berghof, Göring's residence, Bormann's own house, the SS barracks, the bunker network, and the little chalet on the Kehlstein summit were all, in the end, part of a single interconnected story. A story that was about to take a dramatic and violent turn as the war in Europe entered its final, catastrophic weeks. What happened to each of these structures in the spring of 1945 and in the years that followed would diverge in ways that even the people who lived and worked at Obersalzberg during the war could scarcely have predicted. Some would be blown to rubble by British bombers. Some would be burned by the SS on Hitler's own orders. Some would survive largely by accident, spared not through any grand plan, but through the simple chaos and confusion of an advancing army racing to claim the ultimate trophy of victory. And one, against nearly every expectation, would still be standing, open for business, nearly 80 years later. It is worth dwelling for a moment longer on the sheer logistics of building anything at all on a ridge as narrow and exposed as the summit of the Kehlstein. Engineers first had to solve the problem of simply getting men, machinery and material up to an elevation where no permanent structure had ever existed before, on a mountain accessible previously only to the most determined hikers and alpine climbers. The decision to blast a road directly into the cliff face, rather than attempt some less ambitious alternative such as a simple cable car or funicular railway, reflected Bormann's insistence on a dramatic, imposing approach worthy of the building it would lead to, one where visiting dignitaries would experience the full theatrical weight of the ascent, winding through tunnel after tunnel carved from solid granite before finally arriving at the base of the elevator shaft that would carry them the last leg of the journey straight up through the mountain's interior. Surveying teams had to map the unstable, avalanche-prone terrain with extraordinary care, and engineers turned to methods and materials at the very cutting edge of 1930s construction technology, using specially formulated fast-setting concrete to stabilize sections of roadway blasted from crumbling rock faces, and installing extensive drainage systems to prevent the alpine snowmelt from washing away the newly built surface each spring. Contemporary engineers who have studied the project in later decades have consistently marveled at the quality of the underlying construction, noting that the road and tunnel system has required remarkably little structural intervention in the 80-plus years since its completion, a testament to the rigor of the original engineering even as the human cost of achieving that engineering excellence also remains impossible to separate from the finished product. The elevator itself deserves particular attention, both for its remarkable technical sophistication and for what it reveals about the psychological dynamics at play among Hitler's inner circle during the project's planning and construction. Boring a vertical shaft 124 meters straight down through solid granite and then installing a functioning, reliable elevator system within that shaft represented an engineering challenge with few direct precedents anywhere in Europe at the time. The finished elevator car, with its polished brass fittings, ornate mirrors and green leather seating, was designed to convey exactly the kind of understated luxury that Bormann believed would properly impress the diplomatic visitors the building was ostensibly created to entertain. And yet this same engineering marvel became, by multiple contemporary accounts, a source of genuine anxiety for the one man the entire project had been built to please. Hitler's discomfort with the elevator went beyond simple unfamiliarity with a novel piece of technology. His stated fear that the large metal winch mechanism mounted on the building's roof might act as a natural lightning rod during one of the frequent alpine thunderstorms that swept across the Kehlstein summit reflected a deeper and well-documented pattern of anxiety about mechanical failure and structural vulnerability that ran through much of his adult life. Bormann's determination to conceal the two lightning strikes that had actually occurred during the building's construction speaks to just how seriously this fear was taken within Hitler's immediate circle, an acknowledgement that even minor confirmation of the Führer's underlying anxieties could jeopardize the entire multi-million Reichsmark project. What then are we to make of a monument built at such staggering human and financial cost for a man who would ultimately visit it only 14 documented times before abandoning it altogether for the final 5 years of his life? Historians studying the psychology of the Nazi leadership have long noted the peculiar disconnect between the regime's public projection of absolute, unshakable confidence and the private anxieties, insecurities, and physical ailments that afflicted many of its most senior figures, Hitler very much included. The eagle's nest in this light becomes almost a physical manifestation of that disconnect. a building whose exterior grandeur was meant to project an image of untouchable, godlike power, even as the man it was built to honor privately regarded it with something closer to dread. Perhaps no other structure built during the Third Reich captures quite so vividly the gap between Nazi propaganda's carefully constructed image of its leader and the considerably more human, more anxious reality that lay behind that image. To understand why the Allies eventually decided to strike Obersalzberg at all, it helps to look more closely at what the complex had become by the final winter of the war. This was no longer simply Hitler's holiday home. It had grown into a small, self-contained town built entirely for the Nazi elite, ringed by fortifications and populated by thousands of SS guards, administrative staff, and party functionaries. The Berghof itself sprawled across multiple wings with a great hall capable of hosting large receptions, a famous picture window that could be lowered entirely into the floor to open the room to the mountain vista beyond, and Hitler's private study where countless wartime decisions were made. Nearby stood the residence of Hermann Göring, decorated in a style as ostentatious as the man himself, and the home of Martin Bormann, who by this point in the war had accumulated enormous personal power as Hitler's private secretary and the man who controlled virtually all paperwork and access reaching the Führer. The SS Leibstandarte barracks housed the elite guard unit responsible for security across the entire restricted zone, while the nearby Hotel Zum Türken, seized from its original owners back in 1933, had been converted into quarters for the Reichssicherheitsdienst, the security service responsible for protecting Hitler's person. Even the local hotel industry had been swallowed into the Nazi machine, with the once public Platterhof Hotel, where Hitler had stayed on his earliest visits to the region back in the 1920s, transformed into a restricted facility reserved for special party guests only. By early 1945, the strategic calculus for the Allies had shifted. Germany's military collapse was accelerating on every front, and Allied bombing commanders were increasingly confident in their ability to strike targets with a degree of precision that would have been impossible earlier in the war. The head of RAF Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, proposed an attack on Obersalzberg, framing it publicly as support for the advancing American 15th Corps, which was racing toward Munich and would eventually push on toward Berchtesgaden itself. Some historians have suggested more complicated motivations lay behind the raid. The historian Oliver Haller has argued that Harris, who had faced mounting criticism for the controversial area bombing campaigns conducted against German cities earlier in the war, wanted to use the Obersalzberg raid as a demonstration that his forces were equally capable of precise, targeted strikes against a specific, symbolically important objective. The historian Despina Strategikos has offered a different but complementary interpretation, suggesting that Allied planners hoped the destruction of the Berghof would help convince die-hard Nazi loyalists that the war was truly lost beyond any doubt, while simultaneously erasing a site closely associated with a humiliating pre-war policy of appeasement, the same policy that had seen Chamberlain travel to this very mountainside in 1938 in a failed attempt to avoid war altogether. The raid itself was launched on April 25, 1945, and it was an operation of tremendous scale for a single target. A force of 359 Avro Lancaster heavy bombers drawn from No. 1, No. 5 and No. 8 groups of RAF Bomber Command took to the air, accompanied by 16 de Havilland Mosquito Pathfinder aircraft whose job was to mark the target precisely for the following waves of bombers. 98 American P-51 Mustang fighters flew alongside British fighter escorts to protect the bomber stream from any remaining Luftwaffe interception, though by this stage of the war, German air power had been almost entirely destroyed. Among the attacking force was the legendary No. 6 17 Squadron, famous as the Dam Busters for their earlier raid against German dams using specially designed bouncing bombs. This time, the squadron carried 6-ton tallboy deep penetration bombs, weapons specifically designed to punch through reinforced concrete and detonate underground, ideal for an attack aimed at least partly at destroying the bunker network believed to lie beneath the complex. Conditions on the day were nearly perfect for bombing, with clear skies and minimal cloud cover allowing the crews an unusually good view of their target. In total, the attacking force released roughly 1,232 tons of high explosive bombs onto the Obersalzberg complex. The human cost on the German side amounted to 31 dead, a relatively modest figure given the scale of the attack, reflecting the fact that most of the complex's residents and staff had already fled in the preceding days and weeks as the military situation deteriorated. The Allies did not escape unscathed either. 2 bombers were shot down during the raid, with the loss of 4 airmen, a reminder that even in the war's final days, German anti-aircraft defences remained capable of inflicting casualties. The physical results of the raid were significant, but not quite as comprehensive as the attacking force might have hoped. The Berghof itself was struck by at least 2 direct bomb hits and suffered considerable structural damage, though the building's shell remained standing. The SS barracks, Göring's residence, and numerous other buildings across the complex sustained heavy damage as well, with many effectively reduced to ruins. The underground bunker network, the primary target for the specialized tallboy bombs, proved far more resilient than the buildings above it, suffering only slight damage despite the enormous explosive power directed against it, a testament to the engineering that had gone into its construction. And in a detail that would prove enormously significant for the story that follows, the Kehlstein house itself, the Eagle's Nest, was not directly hit at all. Whether this was due to deliberate targeting decisions, the building's small size and relatively exposed, isolated position making it a difficult target compared to the sprawling Berghof complex below, or simple chance amid the chaos of a massive bombing raid, remains a matter of some historical debate. What is certain is that when the bombers finally turned for home, the little chalet on the mountaintop remained standing, its brass elevator undamaged, its marble fireplace still intact, even as the buildings clustered around the Berghof lower down the mountain lay in smoking ruins. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, Obersalzberg was rapidly abandoned by what remained of its Nazi occupants. With Soviet forces already fighting in the streets of Berlin and Hitler himself confined to his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the mountain retreat that had once symbolized the regime's power had become an irrelevance, a target, rather than a fortress. On Hitler's own orders, transmitted from Berlin in the final days before his suicide, SS personnel stationed at Obersalzberg set fire to the already damaged Berghof, apparently determined to ensure that the building would not fall into Allied hands intact, whether for propaganda purposes or simple souvenir hunting. This deliberate act of destruction took place on May 4th, 1945, just 4 days after Hitler had taken his own life in the Berlin bunker, and only hours before Allied forces finally arrived to claim the mountain their bombers had already devastated. The race to reach Berchtesgaden and the ruins of Obersalzberg became something of a competitive scramble among different Allied units in the final days of the war, each eager to claim the symbolic prize of capturing Hitler's mountain retreat. The American 3rd Infantry Division, advancing alongside the French 2nd Armoured Division, arrived at Berchtesgaden itself on May 4th, only hours after the SS had finished burning the Berghof and pulled out. Which specific unit could claim credit for first reaching the smouldering ruins became, and remains to this day, a matter of considerable dispute and confusion. Popular accounts have often conflated the capture of the town of Berchtesgaden with the capture of the Obersalzberg complex itself, and further conflated both of these with the eventual capture of the Eagle's Nest, 3 related but genuinely distinct achievements that took place across slightly different timelines and involved different units. According to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, it was the American 3rd Infantry Division that could rightfully claim to have first taken the town of Berchtesgaden, though notably Eisenhower's own account makes no specific mention of the Eagle's Nest at all. Elements of the French 2nd Armoured Division, including the famous La Nuive Company, composed largely of Spanish Republican exiles who had fled fascism in their own country only to find themselves fighting fascism again in France's colonial and metropolitan forces, entered the town on May 4th as well, working alongside the American 7th Infantry Regiment. Because the Americans had largely confined their initial advance to the town of Berchtesgaden itself, it was French troops who took advantage of the situation to push on toward the ruins of the Berghof up on Obersalzberg. In a small jeep, French Captain Laurent Touilleras and his driver, Brigadier François Borg, managed to overtake the slower-moving half-tracks of the French 2nd Armoured Division, struggling up the mountain slopes, and in doing so, became among the very first Allied soldiers to reach the still smoking shell of Hitler's mountain residence. Other French officers, including Georges Bouy and Paul Repiton-Preneuf, arrived at Obersalzberg during the night of May 4th into May 5th, collecting personal items from among the ruins and photographing the extraordinary scene of Nazi Germany's mountain headquarters, reduced to rubble and ash. French troops would remain in the area for a matter of days, gathering souvenirs and documenting what they found, before being asked to withdraw by American commanders on May 10th, part of the broader arrangement under which Berchtesgaden and its surrounding territory fell within the American occupation zone rather than the French one. The question of who first reached the Eagle's Nest specifically is even murkier than the question of who first reached the Berghof. Some accounts credit elements of the American 7th Infantry Regiment with reaching as far as the base of the Kehlstein elevator. One frequently repeated story holds that 2 American soldiers, Hermann Louis Finel and an ammunition carrier serving alongside him, were the first men to actually enter the building and explore its underground passages, discovering rooms filled with destroyed paintings, evening gowns, medical equipment, and a well-stocked wine cellar. In later interviews conducted long after the war, however, Finel himself clarified that his unit had actually entered the Berghof rather than the Kehlstein house, muddying an already confused historical record. The famed 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles who had fought so valiantly at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, also laid claim to being first at both Berchtesgaden and the Eagle's Nest specifically, a claim that has been contested by veterans of other units in the decades since. French General Georges Bouy, for his part, maintained that he and fellow officer Paul Repiton-Preneuf were the very first Allied soldiers to actually set foot inside the Eagle's Nest, arriving early in the morning of May 5th and departing shortly afterward when they observed both French and American reinforcements beginning to arrive at the summit in greater numbers. In truth, given the chaos of those final days with multiple units converging on the same objectives from different directions and with record-keeping understandably imperfect amid the collapse of an entire regime, it may simply be impossible to establish with total certainty which individual soldiers were first to climb the mountain and step inside Bormann's mountaintop creation. What is not in dispute is the condition in which the Allies found the Eagle's Nest when they did finally reach it. Unlike the smoking, gutted ruin of the Berghof just a short distance below, the Kehlstein house stood essentially intact, its brass elevator still functional, its ornate interior fittings still largely in place, offering an almost eerie glimpse of Nazi luxury frozen in time at the exact moment the regime collapsed. For soldiers who had fought their way across Europe through years of brutal combat, the discovery of this untouched monument to Hitler's power, perched at the summit of a mountain that had somehow escaped the destruction visited upon everything around it, proved an irresistible temptation. EOF. What followed at Obersalzberg was a wave of looting on a scale that historian Despina Stratigakos has argued was unmatched anywhere else in occupied Germany, a reflection of just how uniquely valuable the site was as a source of trophies connected directly to Hitler and the highest levels of the Nazi regime. American and French soldiers alike descended on the ruins of the Berghof and the still-standing Eagle's Nest, carrying away everything from furniture and silverware to fragments of the buildings themselves. At the Eagle's Nest, the beautiful red marble fireplace gifted by Mussolini became a particular target, with soldiers chipping off small pieces of the stone to keep as personal souvenirs, damage that remains visible on the fireplace to this day. It would eventually take the posting of official signage declaring the building United States government property, along with the threat of formal disciplinary action, to finally put a stop to the ongoing vandalism. The scale of the looting across the wider Obersalzberg complex meant that pieces of Hitler's personal effects and Nazi memorabilia connected to his mountain retreat ended up scattered across the world in the hands of individual soldiers who brought them home as war trophies, a diffusion of historical material that the American photojournalist Lee Miller, who arrived at Obersalzberg shortly after its capture, observed with a certain grim irony. Miller would later remark that between the destruction of the Berghof and the subsequent looting of what remained, there was scarcely enough left behind to fill even a single museum display dedicated to the fallen dictator, even as fragments of his former home turned up for decades afterward in the private collections of veterans and collectors scattered across the globe. Hermann Göring, who had survived the April 25th bombing raid despite his residence at Obersalzberg being among the buildings damaged in the attack, did not remain free for long after the Allied forces arrived. Already stripped of his succession rights and effectively under arrest on Hitler's orders after a botched attempt to assume leadership of the collapsing Reich in the war's final days, Goering was formally taken into American custody on May 9, 1945, bringing to an end the career of the man who had once been the second most powerful figure in Nazi Germany and the founder of the Luftwaffe. His subsequent trial at Nuremberg, his conviction on charges including crimes against humanity, and his suicide by cyanide capsule on the eve of his scheduled execution are stories that could fill an entire video on their own. But his final days of freedom, spent in the shadow of his ruined Obersalzberg residence, marked a fitting and symbolic end to the era of Nazi grandeur that the mountain complex had once represented. With the fighting in Europe finally over, Obersalzberg passed into the hands of the United States Army, which took over administration of the entire area as part of the broader American occupation zone in southern Germany. The complex's dramatic scenery and relative isolation, the very qualities that had made it attractive to Hitler in the first place, made it equally appealing as a recreational retreat for American military personnel stationed in the region. The former Platterhof Hotel, once reserved exclusively for Nazi party guests, was renamed the General Walker Hotel and repurposed as an American servicemen's recreational facility, part of a broader recreation area established across the district. Meanwhile, the fate of the individual buildings scattered across the complex, most notably the still intact Eagle's Nest, remained genuinely uncertain in these early post-war years. There was serious discussion among American occupation authorities and their German civilian counterparts about whether the Kehlstein house should simply be demolished altogether, following the same logic that would soon be applied to the ruins of the Berghof and the other major Nazi-era structures nearby. A building so closely associated with Hitler's personal history, some argued, had no place surviving into the post-war world where it might become a rallying point for Nazi sympathizers, or an object of morbid, inappropriate fascination for curious visitors. It was local political intervention that ultimately saved the building from the wrecking ball. Accounts differ slightly on the precise details, but historical records credit local officials, including a councillor named Karl Theodor Jakob, who would later go on to found the Berchtesgadener Landesstiftung, or Berchtesgaden Foundation, with successfully lobbying to preserve the Eagle's Nest rather than destroy it alongside the other ruined buildings of the complex. Their arguments centered less on any sentimental attachment to the building's Nazi history and more on practical economic considerations. Berchtesgaden, like much of post-war Germany, faced enormous economic hardship in the years immediately following the collapse of the Third Reich, and the dramatic mountaintop building, along with its extraordinary alpine views, represented a potential source of desperately needed tourist revenue if it could simply be repurposed and reopened to the public rather than reduced to rubble. This pragmatic calculation, weighing economic necessity against the discomfort of preserving a monument built by and for the Nazi elite, would prove decisive in shaping the building's future, setting it apart from virtually every other structure at Obersalzberg that carried similarly toxic historical associations. But what would become of the ruins of everything else? The shattered Berghof, the wrecked homes of Goering and Bormann, the destroyed SS barracks. For nearly 7 years after the war's end, these ruins simply sat abandoned on the mountainside, gradually being reclaimed by the surrounding forest, but still clearly recognizable to anyone who wandered up from the valley below. And wander up they did. As the initial shock and devastation of the immediate post-war period gave way to the strange new realities of a divided, occupied Germany, the ruins of Obersalzberg began attracting an unwelcome type of visitor. Reports emerged through the early 1950s describing the site as an informal gathering place for unrepentant Nazis, old party loyalists, and a disturbing number of younger sympathizers drawn to the ruins as a kind of dark pilgrimage site, a place where the memory of the fallen regime could still be honored, however furtively, among the broken stones of Hitler's former home. This development alarmed both German and American authorities, who worried that the ruins were becoming exactly the kind of shrine to Nazism that the Allies had hoped to prevent when they bombed the complex in the first place. Bavarian state authorities responded with a plan every bit as decisive as the wartime bombing raid had been. The remaining ruins would be systematically demolished, not merely damaged further but comprehensively removed from the landscape, with the debris cleared away and the sites eventually allowed to return to forest, erasing as much physical trace of the Nazi presence as possible. The decision proved deeply controversial among local residents, many of whom had built a modest post-war tourism trade around visitors curious to see the ruins. however uncomfortable their origins. Heated debates played out in the pages of local newspapers throughout the months leading up to the planned demolition, disagreements so intense that they reportedly spilled over into physical altercations in local beer halls between those who favoured preservation, however grim, and those who wanted every trace of the complex erased for good. The authorities held firm despite the local opposition, and on April 30th, 1952, precisely 7 years to the day after Hitler had taken his own life in his Berlin bunker, the ruins of the Berghof were dynamited into rubble. The Bavarian government did not stop with Hitler's own residence. In the same coordinated demolition campaign, the homes of Göring and Bormann, the SS barracks, the so-called Kampfhäusl, a small structure associated with Hitler's early political struggles, and even a small tea house on nearby Muslanekopf Hill, where Hitler had walked daily after lunch during his residency at the Berghof, were all levelled as well. In total, more than 50 separate Nazi-era buildings across the Obersalzberg complex were destroyed as part of this post-war reckoning with the physical remnants of the regime. The event drew significant international press attention, with major publications including Life magazine covering the demolition as a symbolic final chapter in the destruction of Hitler's mountain empire. Afterward, Bavarian authorities took a deliberately minimalist approach to the cleared sites, declining to install any interpretive signage or historical markers, posting only simple "do not trespass" warnings and allowing nature to gradually reclaim the footprints of the vanished buildings. Notice what is conspicuously absent from that long list of demolished structures. The Eagle's Nest itself was not included in the 1952 destruction campaign. While the Berghof, the residences of the top Nazi leadership, and the SS barracks were all reduced to rubble that spring day, the little chalet perched at the summit of the Kehlstein, along with its remarkable elevator system and access road, remained standing, untouched by the explosives that erased so much of what had surrounded it. The reasoning behind this distinction reflects the same practical calculations that had spared the building from demolition immediately after the war. Unlike the Berghof, which stood at the symbolic and literal heart of Hitler's personal residence and daily life, the Eagle's Nest had always occupied a slightly different category in the public imagination, a diplomatic showpiece that Hitler himself had rarely used, situated at a spectacular and physically separate location, from the cluster of buildings more directly associated with the day-to-day operation of Hitler's mountain headquarters. Local officials continued to press the case that the building's isolation, its physical distance from the rest of the complex, and its undeniable tourist appeal made it a poor candidate for the same fate as its neighbours. This time their arguments carried the day decisively. While the rest of Obersalzberg was being wiped from the map, the Eagle's Nest was instead being prepared for an entirely different future, one that would see it transform from a monument to Nazi power into something far more mundane, and in its own strange way, far more enduring. How did German society at large process this uneven treatment of Hitler's various residences, one bombed by the enemy and then dynamited by its own government, the other quietly repurposed and preserved? The truth is that for many years the answer was simply that they didn't process it much at all, at least not openly. The dominant mood across West Germany in the 1950s was one of determined forward motion, a period historians often describe using the German word Vergangenheitsbewältigung only in its earliest, most incomplete form, a struggling and often reluctant coming to terms with the past that would not truly mature into the more thorough historical reckoning of later decades until well into the 1970s and 1980s. The physical erasure of the Berghof and its surrounding buildings fit neatly into this broader pattern. Rather than preserving the ruins as a permanent, unavoidable reminder of what had happened there, the preferred approach was removal and, where possible, forgetting, or at least a kind of enforced silence. Signs would eventually be posted warning against trespassing, but for decades no historical marker of any kind explained to curious visitors exactly what had once stood on the empty, tree-covered slope where the Berghof's Grand Hall had once offered Hitler a panoramic view of the mountains he claimed as the eternal heartland of the German people. This same instinct toward erasure rather than education would eventually be challenged and ultimately reversed, but that reckoning was still decades away in the spring of 1952 when the explosive charges brought down the last standing walls of Hitler's mountain residence. Meanwhile, up on the Kehlstein summit, an entirely different process was quietly getting underway. Even as the demolition crews were preparing their charges down at the Berghof site, arrangements were already being finalized to reopen the surviving Eagle's Nest to the public as a functioning tourist attraction. The building that Bormann had spent a fortune constructing as a monument to the eternal glory of the Thousand-Year Reich, a Reich that had, in the end, lasted barely 12 years, was about to embark on a second life entirely disconnected from anything its original architects could have imagined. A life spent serving beer and traditional Bavarian food to tourists from around the world, rather than serving diplomatic ambitions to foreign statesmen. That transformation, and the decades of debate, controversy, and quiet normalization that followed it, forms the next chapter in the strange afterlife of Hitler's mountain retreat, a story that continues to unfold even today, as new generations of visitors ride the same brass elevator that once carried Eva Braun, Martin Bormann, and on just 14 documented occasions, Adolf Hitler himself, up through the solid granite of the Kehlstein Mountain toward one of the most breathtaking and most historically fraught views in all of Europe. One question that naturally arises when examining the April 1945 raid is why the Eagle's Nest itself, despite being a known and clearly visible structure perched at the summit of the Kehlstein, escaped the kind of direct, deliberate targeting that levelled so much of the complex around it. Some historians and site interpreters have suggested the building may simply have been considered a secondary objective compared to the Berghof and the underground bunker network, both of which were seen as far more significant targets given their roles as Hitler's actual residence and his planned wartime shelter, respectively. The Kehlstein house, by contrast, had by 1945 become something of a diplomatic relic, rarely used and strategically insignificant, a building whose destruction would have offered little practical military value beyond its symbolic association with the regime. Others have pointed to simple practical targeting difficulties, noting that the building's small footprint, isolated position on an exposed ridge, and lack of any obvious military installation nearby, unlike the heavily fortified Berghof complex with its anti-aircraft batteries and camouflage netting, may have made it a comparatively low priority for bomber crews focused on maximizing damage against the primary target cluster below. Whatever the precise explanation, the outcome proved enormously consequential for everything that followed. A building spared almost by accident amid one of the war's final major air operations, destined to become one of the very few intact physical remnants of Hitler's personal domain anywhere in Germany. The immediate days following the capture of Obersalzberg produced a flood of first-hand accounts from Allied soldiers and journalists who witnessed the surreal scene of Nazi Germany's mountain headquarters in its final hours of existence. War correspondents flocked to the area alongside combat troops, eager to document what many understood instantly to be one of the most historically significant moments of the entire European campaign, the physical heart of Hitler's alpine domain finally falling into Allied hands just days after the dictator's own death in far-off Berlin. Soldiers photographed themselves posing amid the wreckage of the Berghof, standing on the terrace where Hitler had once received Chamberlain, sitting in chairs pulled from the ruins of rooms that had witnessed some of the 20th century's most consequential political decisions. At the Eagle's Nest, still standing and largely undamaged, the atmosphere among the first arriving troops reportedly combined genuine awe at the building's dramatic setting, with a kind of grim curiosity about the lifestyle of the men who had built and used it, wandering through rooms furnished with a luxury that stood in stark, almost obscene contrast to the devastation their own advance had left across the rest of Europe. The scale of looting that followed extended well beyond simple souvenir hunting by individual soldiers. Significant quantities of fine art, wine, and other valuable items had been stored at various points across the Obersalzberg complex, some of it looted by the Nazis themselves from occupied territories across Europe during the war years, and the confusion of the final capture created opportunities for both official confiscation by Allied art recovery units and less official, more opportunistic seizure by individual soldiers and officers. Military intelligence teams specifically tasked with recovering looted art and locating fleeing Nazi officials descended on the region in the weeks following the capture, adding yet another layer of activity to the already chaotic scene. Some of the wine found in the extensive cellars beneath the Berghof and other Obersalzberg buildings reportedly found its way into the personal collections of Allied officers, a small, almost farcical footnote to the broader story of plunder and recovery that defined those first confused weeks of occupation. As the initial chaos of the capture gave way to the more orderly business of military occupation, American forces settled into a longer-term administrative role across the Obersalzberg district. one that would persist in various forms for more than 50 years. The establishment of the recreational facility at the former Platterhof and the eventual return of at least partial control over the Eagle's Nest itself to German civilian authorities in the 1950s and fully by 1960 reflected the gradual, uneven process by which the American occupation of Germany transitioned from military governance toward a more normalized relationship between occupier and occupied. A process that unfolded across the entire country, but that played out with particular symbolic weight at a site so closely associated with the very regime the Allies had fought to destroy. With the decision made to preserve rather than destroy the Eagle's Nest, Bavarian authorities moved relatively quickly to put the building to productive use. In 1952, the same year the Berghof was being reduced to rubble down the mountainside, the state government leased the Kehlstein House for a period of 10 years to the German Alpine Association, a well-established organization with long experience managing mountain huts and alpine tourist facilities across Bavaria. The Alpine Association, in turn, sublet the day-to-day operation of the building to a local restaurateur named Josef Kellerbauer, who took on responsibility for repairing and renovating the structure and converting it into what would become the restaurant that, in one form or another, continues to operate at the summit today. The damaged access road, unused and deteriorating since the war's end, was repaired and reopened to allow the necessary supplies and eventually visitors to reach the mountaintop once again. A dedicated bus stop was established at the base of the route, near the Hotel Zum Türken in Obersalzberg, marking the beginning of the transportation system that remains in use in a similar form to this day. Some historical accounts suggest that even as this civilian tourism operation was being established, the United States military continued to maintain some form of presence or interest in the site through much of the 1950s, and there is a degree of variation in different sources regarding exactly when full administrative control passed entirely into German civilian hands. What is generally agreed upon is that by 1960, any remaining American military involvement with the Kehlstein House had concluded, and the building was formally returned to the full administration of the state of Bavaria. That same year, a new public bus terminal was opened at a location known as the Hintereck, streamlining the process by which ordinary tourists, rather than military personnel or specially permitted visitors, could make the journey up the mountain. From this point forward, the Eagle's Nest settled into a role it has occupied ever since, that of a seasonal mountain restaurant and beer garden, drawing visitors not primarily for its Nazi history, but for its truly extraordinary alpine views, which on a clear day stretch for well over 100 miles across the peaks of Bavaria, Austria, and beyond. The management of the site has changed hands numerous times over the subsequent decades, though the essential business model has remained remarkably consistent. When the Alpine Association's initial 10-year lease expired around 1962, responsibility for the property transferred to the local Berchtesgaden Tourism Association, which continued to work with Kellerbauer's restaurant concession before eventually passing management on to a series of successor operators, including Franz Sichert and later Norbert Eder, whose family has continued to operate the concession into recent years, maintaining a level of continuity in the site's commercial operation that stands in stark contrast to the violent upheaval of its wartime history. Today, the building itself is formally owned by a charitable trust connected to the Bavarian state government, ensuring that whatever commercial revenue the restaurant and beer garden generate serves broader public and charitable purposes, rather than simply enriching a private landlord. A structural arrangement that reflects the site's uniquely sensitive historical status even 8 decades after the war's end. One particularly interesting and enduring feature of the site's post-war management has been the deliberate restriction on private vehicle access. Since 1952, the narrow, winding Kehlsteinstrasse has been closed to private cars entirely, a restriction originally imposed for practical reasons given the road's limited width and the danger posed by two-way traffic on a route that includes a single hairpin turn and passages through 5 separate tunnels blasted into the mountainside. Instead, visitors wishing to reach the summit must either purchase tickets for specially modified buses, designed with the engine power necessary to handle the steep, twisting ascent, or undertake the considerably more strenuous option of hiking to the top, a journey that typically takes around 2 hours on foot from the Obersalzberg area below. This arrangement, purely practical in its origins, has had the secondary effect of controlling and moderating the flow of visitors to the site, preventing the kind of uncontrolled, unrestricted access that might otherwise have made the building an even more prominent and less easily managed tourist destination, or, more troublingly, a more accessible gathering point for those drawn to the location for less innocent reasons than simple historical curiosity or scenic appreciation. That concern, the possibility that the Eagle's Nest might attract visitors motivated by genuine sympathy for the Nazi regime rather than ordinary historical interest, has never entirely disappeared from the site's management, even decades after the war's end. Today, informal guided tours of the building can be arranged through the official operator's website, but a striking policy remains firmly in place. No external or independent tour guides are permitted to lead groups through the building. This restriction exists specifically to prevent the possibility of unauthorized individuals using access to the historically significant lower rooms of the building as an opportunity to deliver their own unofficial and potentially sympathetic or revisionist narratives about Hitler and the Nazi regime to unsuspecting tourists. The lower rooms of the Eagle's Nest, notably, are not part of the functioning restaurant space at all. These areas can only be viewed with an approved guide, and visitors observe much of the building's original interior through plate glass windows rather than being permitted to wander freely, a physical barrier that mirrors the careful curatorial distance the site's operators try to maintain between the building's dark history and its present-day function as a tourist attraction. Graffiti left behind by Allied soldiers during the chaotic days of May 1945 remains visible in parts of the building's original woodwork even today, an unintentional historical record layered atop the building's Nazi-era construction. Hitler's own small private study, once presumably intended for quiet contemplation or important diplomatic conversations, has been repurposed in a fashion that some visitors find almost jarringly mundane, converted into nothing more than a storage room for the cafeteria that now operates in the building. The famous Mussolini fireplace, its red Italian marble still bearing the scars of decades-old souvenir hunting by Allied soldiers, remains one of the building's most photographed features, a physical link between the extravagant diplomatic ambitions Bormann once held for the structure and the far more modest tourist attraction it has become. Visitors today can also access a hiking trail that leads beyond the Eagle's Nest itself toward the nearby Mandelgrat Ridge, connecting eventually to the summit of the Hohe Gol, the larger peak of which the Kehlstein forms merely a subordinate outcropping, a route considered relatively accessible for those equipped with appropriate climbing gear via a Via Ferrata-style protected climbing path. While the Eagle's Nest itself survived and was gradually transformed into a functioning restaurant, the story of the surrounding Obersalzberg area continued to evolve in its own complicated ways throughout the second half of the 20th century. The Hotel Zum Türken, the building seized from its original owners back in 1933 and used during the war as quarters for Hitler's personal security detail, suffered heavy damage during the April 1945 bombing raid, but was not among the structures targeted for demolition in 1952. Instead, the hotel was eventually returned to the family that had originally owned it before the Nazi seizure, and it reopened its doors to the public, operating in various forms for decades, and even offering visitors the opportunity to explore a portion of the underground bunker network that still existed beneath the property, providing a rare, largely unaltered glimpse into the wartime tunnel system, in stark contrast to the far more polished and curated presentation found within the walls of the Eagle's Nest itself. The Hotel Zum Türken would eventually close its doors in 2020, changing hands in a sale whose long-term implications for public access to that portion of the historic bunker network remains somewhat uncertain. The former Platterhof Hotel, renamed the General Walker Hotel during its decades of service as an American military recreation facility, continued to operate under United States Army administration until 1996, when the American forces finally withdrew from the region entirely and handed the property back to the Bavarian government. Rather than preserve the building, which by that point carried its own complicated layered history spanning both the Nazi era and the subsequent decades of American military use, authorities chose to demolish it in 2001, clearing the way for new development on the site. Where the Platterhof and other American-era facilities had once stood, a luxury Kempinski hotel would eventually rise, along with expanded parking and visitor facilities designed to accommodate the substantial modern tourist traffic that now flows through the area every summer season. A jarring architectural juxtaposition between five-star contemporary hospitality and the underground remnants of Hitler's wartime bunker network still lying beneath portions of the property. Perhaps the most significant development in how the wider Obersalzberg area came to terms with its own history arrived in 1999 with the opening of the Dokumentationszentrum Obersalzberg, or Obersalzberg Documentation Center, built on the grounds of the former Platterhof hotel complex. This museum represented a fundamental shift in approach from the deliberate erasure and silence that had characterized the Bavarian government's handling of the site in the 1950s. Rather than simply hoping visitors would forget what had once stood on the mountainside, the Documentation Center set out to actively educate the public about Obersalzberg's role as a center of Nazi power, using extensive photographs, original documents, audio recordings, film footage, and a detailed scale model overlaying the vanished historical buildings onto the contemporary landscape to help visitors understand exactly what had once occupied the now largely forested slopes. The museum also provides guided access to a portion of the underground bunker system, allowing visitors to walk through sections of the 6 kilometers of tunnels originally carved by forced laborers beginning in 1943, complete with wartime graffiti still visible on some of the walls where workers or soldiers left their marks decades ago. The Documentation Center underwent a major renovation in the early 2020s, reopening on September 27, 2023, with an extensively updated permanent exhibition organized into 5 thematic chapters exploring the acquisition and transformation of the Obersalzberg properties, the daily life of the Nazi elite who lived there, the displacement and suffering of local residents pushed out to make way for the regime's mountain retreat, the wartime events that unfolded at the site, and the complicated post-war reckoning with everything that had happened there. Historians and local officials have credited this shift toward education and open historical engagement, rather than silence and erasure, with having a measurably positive effect on the character of visitors drawn to the area. Since the Documentation Center's opening, officials have reported a noticeable decline in the kind of furtive Nazi sympathizer activity that had worried authorities so deeply back in the early 1950s, and that had originally justified the demolition of the Berghof ruins in the first place. The museum has proven remarkably popular in its own right, drawing millions of visitors in the decades since its opening, suggesting that a substantial public appetite exists for confronting this difficult history directly rather than avoiding it altogether. And yet, as the next chapter of this story will show, the impulse toward inappropriate reverence for what once stood at Obersalzberg has never been entirely eliminated, even 8 decades after the collapse of the regime that built it. A reminder that the physical remnants of Nazi Germany continue to exert a strange and sometimes troubling pull on certain visitors, regardless of how thoroughly the surrounding history has been documented, contextualized, and explained. Even today, the empty forested plot where the Berghof once stood continues to draw a small but persistent stream of visitors whose motivations trouble the site's caretakers. Walking through the woods near the former Berghof location, one finds almost nothing to indicate what once occupied the ground, just a section of retaining wall from the original terracing, some scattered remnants of foundation where the grand staircase once stood, and since 2008, a single modest billboard providing basic historical information for anyone who happens to wander close enough to read it. For decades before that marker was installed, the site offered no official acknowledgement at all of its own history. The path leading through what had been the driveway to the Berghof's east wing, marked only with directional signage pointing toward other, more clearly labelled destinations nearby, deliberately omitting any reference to the fact that Hitler's mountain residence had once stood just a few meters away. Since 2015, staff at the Documentation Center have made a practice of periodically collecting objects left at the Berghof site by visitors whose intentions are unmistakably reverential rather than merely curious, grave candles and lanterns of the sort typically used to honor the dead, some inscribed with messages like "thank you" or "unforgotten", others marked more explicitly with symbols associated with the Nazi regime. Staff have removed more than 50 such items over the years, though they acknowledge the true number left at the site over that period is almost certainly higher, a quiet but persistent reminder that for a small minority of visitors, the wooded clearing where Hitler's home once stood retains a significance entirely different from the historical curiosity that motivates the vast majority of tourists who pass through the area. This tension between historical education and inappropriate commemoration lies at the heart of an ongoing and, in truth, unresolved debate about how best to manage sites connected to Hitler and the broader Nazi regime. The Eagle's Nest itself sits somewhat uneasily within this debate, unlike the Berghof site, which has been almost entirely stripped of its Nazi-era physical fabric and now relies on nearby museum interpretation and a single, modest billboard to convey its historical significance. The Kehlstein House remains a fully intact, physically imposing structure that visitors can enter, walk through, and, at least in the areas designated as restaurant space, dine within, all while gazing out at the very same panoramic mountain views that Bormann designed the building specifically to showcase. Some critics have argued that this arrangement risks presenting the building's Nazi history as a kind of curious footnote to what is, in practical terms, simply a scenic mountain restaurant, an approach to historical memory that prioritizes tourism revenue and visitor enjoyment over the kind of sober, unflinching historical reckoning offered just down the mountain at the Documentation Center. Others counter that maintaining the building's function as an ordinary functioning restaurant, rather than transforming it into a solemn memorial or museum in its own right, actually serves an important purpose, deliberately refusing to grant the structure the kind of reverent, almost sacred status that a more formal memorialization might inadvertently confer, and instead treating it as simply another piece of alpine infrastructure that happens to carry an unusually dark history. The debate over how to interpret and present the Eagle's Nest connects to a much broader question that has confronted Germany, and indeed much of the world, in the decades since the collapse of the Third Reich, namely what should be done with the physical spaces where Hitler and his regime once lived, worked, and made their fateful decisions. The pattern established at Obersalzberg, partial destruction combined with partial preservation, followed eventually by dedicated historical education at a nearby but physically separate documentation center, has been echoed with variations at other sites connected to the Nazi era, across Germany and beyond. Hitler's former apartment in Munich, where he once hosted both Neville Chamberlain and Benito Mussolini during the tense diplomatic maneuvering of the late 1930s, survived the war essentially undamaged, and today occupies the third floor of a functioning police station, accessible to the public only under restricted, carefully managed conditions involving security screening and prior authorization. The old Reich Chancellery in Berlin, badly damaged by Allied bombing during the war, fell within the Soviet occupation zone of the divided city afterward and was ultimately demolished entirely, its history left largely unacknowledged by East German authorities for decades until a historical marker was finally installed, following German reunification in 1990. Each of these sites tells a slightly different story about how post-war authorities, whether in the East or the West, whether immediately after the war or many decades later, have struggled to reconcile the practical and symbolic challenges of managing physical spaces indelibly associated with one of history's most catastrophic regimes. What makes the Eagle's Nest such an unusual case study within this broader pattern is precisely the combination of factors that led to its survival in the first place. Its relative physical isolation from the more historically central buildings of the Obersalzberg complex, the practical tourism revenue it promised to a struggling post-war local economy, and quite possibly simple chance in how it escaped both the RAF's bombs in April 1945 and the Bavarian government's demolition charges 7 years later. Unlike sites deliberately preserved for their historical significance, the Eagle's Nest survived largely for reasons that had relatively little to do with any deliberate decision about how to remember Hitler and everything to do with pragmatic considerations about tourism, road access, and physical geography. Only afterward, once the building's survival was already an established fact, did the harder questions about how to responsibly manage and present a surviving Nazi monument begin to take shape in earnest, questions that continue to occupy historians, museum curators, and Bavarian state officials to this very day. So what does a visit to the Eagle's Nest actually look like today for the roughly 2,000 tourists who make the journey up the mountain on a typical summer day? The experience begins not at the summit itself, but down at the Hinterrek bus terminal, a facility that has grown considerably more developed over the decades since the simple bus stop first established in 1952. Modern visitors now find a small complex including souvenir shops, an additional restaurant serving traditional Bavarian fare, and further historical information supplementing what is available at the larger documentation centre a short distance away. From here, specially modified buses, engineered with the power and gearing necessary to handle the steep, narrow, switchback-laden ascent, carry passengers up the same 6.5-kilometre road blasted out of the mountainside by forced and paid labourers alike back in 1937 and 1938. The road remains a genuine engineering marvel, even by contemporary standards, passing through the same 5 tunnels originally carved for the project, navigating the same single hairpin turn that Bormann's engineers considered an acceptable compromise for a mountain route of this severity. Reaching the tunnel entrance near the summit, visitors then step into the same brass and mirror-lined elevator car that once carried Hitler, Eva Braun, Josef and Magda Goebbels, and countless Nazi Party officials the final 124 metres up through solid granite. A journey that takes less than a minute, but that connects present-day tourists directly and viscerally to one of the 20th century's darkest chapters. Emerging from the elevator, visitors find themselves inside the restaurant and beer garden that now occupies most of the Kehlstein house, ordering pretzels, sausages, and locally brewed beer while taking in views that, on a clear day, extend across dozens of alpine peaks, spanning Germany, Austria, and beyond. Genuinely one of the most spectacular panoramas available anywhere in the Alps. For many visitors, particularly those without extensive prior knowledge of the site's history, the experience can feel almost jarringly disconnected from the weight of what the building represents. Reviews and accounts from tourists frequently note the strange sensation of drinking a cold beer on a sun-soaked terrace, surrounded by families and hikers enjoying an ordinary alpine day out, while remaining acutely aware that this same terrace once hosted Eva Braun sunbathing, Nazi officials plotting the course of a genocidal war, and on a small handful of documented occasions, Adolf Hitler himself gazing out at the same mountains now photographed by thousands of smartphone cameras every single day. The building's operators have made a deliberate choice, whether by design or by the accumulated weight of decades of institutional practice, not to dwell extensively on this history within the restaurant space itself, focusing visitor attention instead on the scenery, the food, and the genuine engineering achievement of the road and elevator system, while directing anyone seeking a fuller historical accounting toward the documentation centre down the mountain, where that harder, more sober history can be properly presented with appropriate context and gravity. This deliberate separation between the celebratory, scenic experience offered at the summit and the sober historical education offered at the base of the mountain represents in its own way a distinctly German approach to processing an impossibly difficult inheritance. It stands in notable contrast to how other nations have handled comparably significant sites connected to their own darkest historical chapters, and it raises genuinely difficult questions that historians, ethicists, and tourism officials continue to debate without easy resolution. Should a building constructed through forced and coerced labour, intended to serve and glorify a regime responsible for the deaths of millions, ever be permitted to operate as an ordinary tourist attraction, complete with beer garden and gift shop, without more explicit and unavoidable historical framing, built directly into the visitor experience itself? Or does the very ordinariness of the modern Eagle's Nest, its transformation from a monument of terror into simply another alpine restaurant among many, represent its own quiet, meaningful victory over everything the building was originally designed to represent? A demonstration that even the most grandiose symbols of totalitarian power can eventually be reduced to nothing more than a pleasant place to enjoy a Bavarian lunch with a nice view? There is no single correct answer to these questions, and reasonable people, including professional historians who have devoted entire careers to studying the Third Reich, continue to disagree about the proper balance between preservation, education, and the simple practical reality that a mountain this beautiful was always going to attract visitors regardless of what history had unfolded there. What can be said with more confidence is that the Eagle's Nest occupies an almost unique position among surviving sites connected to Hitler and the Nazi leadership, a building that escaped destruction not through any grand plan of historical preservation, but through a combination of chance, geographic isolation, and hard-headed post-war economic pragmatism. And that has spent the 8 decades since the war's end slowly, awkwardly, but undeniably transforming from a symbol of absolute power into something closer to a peculiar footnote on an otherwise ordinary alpine day trip, a transformation that Martin Bormann, who poured so much money, so much forced labour, and so much of his own considerable ego into the project, could surely never have imagined when he first conceived of building his master a birthday present unlike anything else in the Reich. Of course, the Eagle's Nest does not exist in isolation from the rest of the story of how post-war Germany, and indeed the wider world, has grappled with the physical remnants of Hitler's regime. To fully understand what makes the survival of the Kehlstein house so unusual, it helps to briefly consider how other major sites connected to the Nazi leadership met very different fates in the decades following the war, some destroyed deliberately and completely, others left to decay through simple neglect, and a rare few, like the Eagle's Nest itself, preserved and repurposed in ways that continue to generate debate to this day. Beyond the philosophical and historical debates surrounding the site, there are countless smaller, stranger details about the modern Eagle's Nest that continue to surprise visitors expecting a more somber, museum-like experience. The restaurant's menu, for instance, offers standard Bavarian mountain hut fare, hearty soups, sausages, strudel, and locally brewed beer served in the same reception hall where Nazi dignitaries once mingled beneath the Mussolini fireplace. Ticket prices for the bus journey have risen steadily over the decades as the site's popularity has grown, and during peak summer months the queues at the Hinterreck bus terminal can stretch long enough that visitors are advised to arrive early in the day or book tickets well in advance to guarantee a spot. The building closes entirely during the winter months, typically from early November through early May, when heavy snowfall and the risk of avalanche make the access road impassable and unsafe for the specially modified tour buses that operate it during the warmer season. This seasonal closure means the Eagle's Nest, much like it was during Hitler's own era, spends roughly half of every year essentially abandoned to the elements. Its brass elevator sitting idle, its terraces buried under snow, before reopening each spring to another wave of curious tourists. Visitor demographics at the site have also shifted considerably over the decades since it first reopened in the 1950s. Early post-war visitors were disproportionately German, often drawn by simple curiosity or the spectacular scenery rather than any particular fascination with the building's Nazi associations, at a time when West German society was still largely reluctant to openly discuss the recent past in any detail. In more recent decades, the visitor base has become considerably more international, with substantial numbers of American, British, and other foreign tourists making the trip specifically because of the site's connection to Hitler, drawn by documentaries, history books, and increasingly by social media posts showcasing the building's dramatic mountaintop setting. This shift has brought its own complications, as tour operators and site managers have had to develop policies for handling visitors whose interest in the building's history ranges from genuine scholarly curiosity to something considerably less appropriate. The policy against permitting independent, unauthorized tour guides to lead groups through the building's historically sensitive lower rooms exists precisely because of concerns that such visitors might otherwise use the opportunity to deliver sympathetic or historically distorted narratives to unsuspecting fellow tourists. A safeguard that reflects lessons learned over decades of managing a site that continues to attract a small but persistent fringe of visitors whose motivations diverge sharply from ordinary historical tourism. The Bavarian authorities and site operators have also had to navigate the delicate matter of Nazi-era symbols and memorabilia in the context of a functioning commercial tourist attraction. German law imposes strict restrictions on the public display and sale of Nazi symbols, including the swastika, restrictions that apply with particular force at a site so directly connected to the regime's history. Gift shops at the Hinterreck base station and the documentation center sell books, postcards and historical materials related to the site, but do so within careful legal and ethical boundaries designed to inform, rather than glorify, a balancing act that reflects Germany's broader, legally codified approach to managing the memory of its Nazi past, an approach considerably more restrictive than the more permissive attitudes toward historical memorabilia found in some other countries. Local residents of Berchtesgaden themselves have developed a complicated, sometimes ambivalent relationship with the tourist economy that has grown up around their region's darkest historical chapter. On one hand, the substantial revenue generated by Eagle's Nest tourism, along with visits to the documentation centre and the broader network of hiking trails and alpine attractions in the surrounding Berchtesgaden National Park, provides crucial economic support for a region that might otherwise struggle to sustain itself on agriculture and traditional alpine industries alone. On the other hand, many residents express a degree of discomfort with the idea that their town's international reputation remains so closely tied to Hitler's presence there nearly a century after he first began visiting the area, a connection that some feel overshadows the region's other, considerably more pleasant attractions, including the pristine Königssee Lake, extensive hiking and skiing opportunities, and a rich cultural history extending back centuries before the Nazi era ever began. This tension between economic necessity and historical discomfort echoes, in miniature, the same underlying tensions that shape the broader post-war debate over whether to preserve or destroy the Eagle's Nest in the first place. A debate that, in its own quiet way, continues to play out in Berchtesgaden's tourism industry to this very day. One more detail worth noting about the modern operation concerns the seasonal staff who run the restaurant and bus operations each year. Many of the guides, servers and bus drivers working at the site during the busy summer months are local residents of Berchtesgaden and the surrounding valley, individuals whose families have often lived in the shadow of the Obersalzberg complex for multiple generations, spanning the Nazi era, the American occupation, and the decades of post-war tourism that followed. For many of these workers, the daily routine of running buses up a mountain road, once blasted out by forced and paid labourers alike, or serving beer in a room where Nazi officials once entertained foreign dignitaries, has become simply that, a routine, a job, a part of the local economy no more remarkable in their daily experience than any. Other seasonal tourism position might be elsewhere in the Alps. This normalization, uncomfortable as it might seem to an outside observer encountering the site for the first time, may in fact represent one of the more genuinely successful outcomes of the entire post-war effort to manage this difficult inheritance, a demonstration that even the most notorious symbols of a fallen regime can, given enough time, enough careful institutional stewardship, and enough deliberate historical education happening in parallel nearby, eventually be absorbed into the unremarkable rhythms of everyday life. Consider, for instance, the fate of the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's primary headquarters on the Eastern Front, hidden deep within the Masurian forest of what was then East Prussia and is today part of Poland. Unlike the Eagle's Nest, which Hitler visited only occasionally and never used as a genuine centre of military operations, the Wolf's Lair was where Hitler actually spent the majority of his time during the war, directing the invasion of the Soviet Union and countless subsequent campaigns from a sprawling complex that eventually grew to include some 50 separate bunkers, 70 barracks buildings, 2 airfields and its own dedicated railway station. It was here, on July 20th, 1944, that Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb in a failed attempt to assassinate Hitler, an event that could have changed the entire course of the war's final year had it succeeded. As Soviet forces approached in January 1945, Hitler ordered the complex destroyed, and SS demolition teams attempted to level the site using massive quantities of dynamite. Remarkably, many of the bunkers proved too structurally sound to fully collapse, their reinforced concrete walls in some cases 8 meters thick, leaving behind a landscape of tilted, shattered ruins that remains eerily recognizable even today. For decades after the war, the site was managed with little historical sensitivity, at various points hosting paintball games, pottery classes, and even opportunities for tourists to pose for photographs in mock Nazi uniforms, an approach so disconnected from appropriate historical memory that the director of Warsaw's own Uprising Museum reportedly described the atmosphere as resembling a grotesque theme park. Only in 2017 did the Polish State Forestry Authority finally assume full control of the site, removing the more tasteless commercial activities and installing proper historical information panels, an intervention that arrived roughly 65 years later than the comparable, if imperfect, steps taken at Obersalzberg. The story of Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia offers yet another contrasting example. This Renaissance-era fortress was requisitioned by Heinrich Himmler beginning in 1934 and transformed into a kind of ideological headquarters and training centre for the SS, a building steeped in occult-inspired Nazi mysticism that Himmler intended to serve as the spiritual center of his SS order for generations to come. As Allied forces approached in the war's final weeks, SS troops attempted to destroy the castle, though like the Wolf's Lair, the demolition proved only partially successful, leaving the North Tower and other portions of the structure still standing. In the post-war decades, rather than being demolished entirely or left to decay, Wewelsburg was gradually repurposed, eventually incorporating a museum dedicated specifically to documenting the crimes of the SS, alongside, somewhat incongruously, a youth hostel operating within other portions of the historic castle complex. This blending of solemn historical education with mundane, everyday use echoes in its own way the uneasy coexistence found at the Eagle's Nest between the building's dark origins and its current function as an alpine restaurant. Compare these varied fates to what became of the Nuremberg rally grounds, the vast complex of parade grounds, stadiums, and monumental architecture where the Nazi Party staged its enormous annual rallies throughout the 1930s, events immortalized in propaganda films that remain instantly recognizable symbols of the regime's carefully staged pageantry, even to viewers with only passing knowledge of the era. Unlike Obersalzberg, much of the physical infrastructure at Nuremberg survived the war largely intact, simply because destroying such enormous stone and concrete structures would have required a bombing effort of an entirely different magnitude than what was directed at smaller targets like the Berghof. Rather than demolish this massive complex, German authorities eventually chose a path of active historical education, broadly similar to what would later be adopted at Obersalzberg, establishing a permanent documentation centre within the grounds in 2001, while allowing much of the surrounding parade ground area to be repurposed for entirely mundane civic uses, including, in one particularly striking juxtaposition, a public park where local residents jog and walk their dogs among the crumbling remains of Hitler's grandstands. What these comparisons reveal is that there was never any single universally applied German policy for dealing with the physical remnants of the Nazi regime. Instead, the fate of each individual site emerged from a complex, often contested interplay of local politics, practical economic considerations, the specific historical significance attached to each location, and, frequently, simple accidents of geography and wartime destruction that left some buildings standing while reducing others to rubble. The Eagle's Nest survived for reasons that had comparatively little to do with any deliberate judgment about its historical importance, and a great deal to do with its physical isolation, the tourism revenue it promised a struggling post-war economy, and the sheer good fortune of escaping direct bomb damage during the April 1945 raid that devastated the buildings clustered around it. Had circumstances been only slightly different, had the RAF's tallboy bombs found their mark on the mountaintop rather than the bunker network below, or had local officials in the early 1950s failed to make their case for preservation, the building that today serves thousands of tourists a summer season beer and pretzels might instead exist only in old photographs, one more casualty among the more than 50 Nazi-era structures wiped from the Obersalzberg landscape in the spring of 1952. There is also something worth reflecting on in the sheer scale of resources that went into building something that, in the end, served its original intended purpose for barely 2 years before the war made diplomatic entertaining at a mountaintop retreat an increasingly irrelevant priority. 12 or more workers died carving the elevator shaft and building the access road. Thousands more laboured through brutal alpine winters, some of them forced labourers working under conditions far removed from the comfortable wages enjoyed by the earliest German and Austrian workers on the project. 30 million Reichsmarks, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era, were poured into a building that Hitler, the very man it was designed to honour and impress, found so uncomfortable that he stopped visiting entirely after October 1940, choosing instead to spend his remaining time at Obersalzberg, down at the more familiar, more grounded Berghof. It is difficult to imagine a more perfect symbol of the Nazi regime's peculiar combination of genuine engineering brilliance, staggering human cost, and ultimate, almost absurd impracticality than a mountaintop palace built at the cost of human lives for a leader who was secretly terrified of the very elevator required to reach it. And yet, in another sense, perhaps the building's survival and its transformation into something as ordinary as a beer garden represents its own kind of quiet justice. The regime that built the Eagle's Nest envisioned a Reich that would last 1,000 years, a mountain fortress from which an unbroken line of German leaders would command an empire stretching across Europe and beyond. Instead, that regime collapsed after just 12 years, its architect dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker, its senior leadership dead, imprisoned, or scattered into hiding across the globe. The mountaintop retreat built to showcase the eternal glory of that doomed project survives today not as a shrine to Hitler's memory, but as a fundamentally unremarkable stop on an alpine day trip, a place where German and international tourists alike order lunch and take selfies against a backdrop of natural beauty that long predates the Third Reich and will presumably long outlast whatever historical memory of it remains. The swastika banners are gone. The SS guards are gone. What remains is simply a very well-built mountain restaurant with an extraordinarily complicated past, a past that the site's caretakers, working in careful coordination with the nearby documentation centre, continue to grapple with, imperfectly but persistently, 8 decades after the war that made this small chalet infamous finally came to its end. The story of the Eagle's Nest, then, is really 2 stories intertwined. It is the story of an extraordinary feat of engineering, achieved at extraordinary human cost, built to serve the vanity and diplomatic ambitions of a regime that would soon plunge the world into its most catastrophic war. And it is also the story of what happens to the physical remnants of atrocity once the atrocity itself has ended. The messy, contested, often accidental process by which societies decide what to preserve, what to destroy, and how to explain what remains to generations who never lived through the original horror. Few buildings anywhere in the world capture both halves of that story quite as vividly, or quite as strangely, as the small chalet, still perched at the summit of the Kehlstein mountain, serving beer to tourists with a view that Adolf Hitler himself found more terrifying than magnificent. It is also worth asking what lessons, if any, the specific case of the Eagle's Nest might offer for how societies handle difficult heritage more broadly, a question that extends well beyond the borders of Germany or the specific history of Nazism. Around the world, communities continue to grapple with monuments, buildings, and landscapes connected to slavery, colonialism, genocide, and other historical atrocities, facing many of the same fundamental questions that confronted Bavarian officials in the early 1950s. Should such sites be destroyed entirely, erasing the physical evidence but potentially also erasing an opportunity for direct historical confrontation and education? Should they be preserved exactly as they were, risking the possibility that preservation shades into inadvertent commemoration or even reverence? Or should they be repurposed, transformed into something new while retaining enough of their original character to prompt reflection, an approach that carries its own risk of normalizing or trivializing the horror originally associated with the site? The Eagle's Nest, precisely because its survival resulted more from accident and pragmatism than from any coherent guiding philosophy, offers something like a natural experiment in what happens when a society backs into an answer to these questions rather than deliberately choosing one from the outset. The results: an intact Nazi-era building operating as a commercial restaurant, paired with a nearby, more rigorously educational documentation centre handling the harder historical work, suggests that perhaps no single approach need apply uniformly across an entire complex of related sites, that different buildings with different histories and different physical characteristics might reasonably call for different treatments even within the boundaries of a single historical complex like Obersalzberg. There is also a generational dimension to this ongoing story that deserves consideration. The German soldiers, officials, and civilians who actually lived through the Nazi era and who made the initial post-war decisions about sites like Obersalzberg have now almost entirely passed away. Their first-hand memories and immediate emotional reactions to the war's end no longer directly available to inform contemporary decision-making. The decisions made today about how to present, interpret, and manage the Eagle's Nest fall instead to a generation with no personal memory of the war at all. Historians, museum professionals, and tourism officials working from documentary evidence, academic scholarship, and an evolving contemporary understanding of best practices in Holocaust and genocide education, rather than from lived experience. This generational shift has generally pushed German institutions toward more thorough, more explicit historical engagement over time. a trajectory visible in the substantial 2023 renovation of the Documentation Centre's exhibitions, which moved toward a more comprehensive, 5-chapter examination of the site's history compared to the more limited presentation available when the museum first opened back in 1999. Whether this trend toward ever more thorough historical engagement will continue, or whether future generations still further removed from the war's living memory might eventually favor different approaches entirely, remains an open question that only time will answer. For now, though, the Eagle's Nest continues its strange, improbable second life, welcoming visitors every summer season to a building that Martin Bormann built at extraordinary cost to honor a leader who could barely stand to visit it, a building that survived a massive Allied bombing raid through what appears to have been little more than chance. A building that escaped a deliberate government demolition campaign because local officials recognized its tourism potential. And a building that today serves as perhaps the single most physically intact, publicly accessible monument anywhere in the world to the peculiar, contradictory nature of Adolf Hitler's personal domain. Equal parts genuine engineering marvel and monument to human cost, equal parts diplomatic showpiece and site. The dictator himself found too frightening to properly enjoy. Few structures anywhere capture quite so completely the strange, unsettling gap between Nazi Germany's carefully constructed image of invincible, eternal power and the considerably more fragile, more human, and ultimately more fleeting reality that lay behind that image, a gap that visitors can still walk through today, riding the same brass elevator, gazing out at the same mountain views, standing in the same rooms where history's most infamous regime, briefly imagined it, had built something that would last 1,000 years. One final point of comparison worth considering involves the Nuremberg trials themselves, the legal proceedings that in many ways set the template for how the post-war world would attempt to reckon with the crimes of the Nazi leadership. Held not far from the ruined rally grounds discussed earlier, the trials brought surviving senior Nazi officials, including Göring, Hess, Speer, and numerous others, before an international tribunal to answer formally for their actions, resulting in verdicts ranging from execution to lengthy imprisonment to, in a small number of cases, acquittal. The very existence of these trials reflected a deliberate Allied decision to pursue formal legal accountability rather than simple summary justice, or alternatively, complete silence about the crimes that had been committed, a decision with obvious parallels to the later choice to establish documentation centers at sites like Obersalzberg and Nuremberg itself, prioritizing structured, evidence-based reckoning over either vengeance or forgetting. Or just as the Nuremberg trials established a legal and moral framework for judging individual Nazi leaders, the slow, uneven evolution of how Germany has chosen to physically preserve, destroy, or reinterpret sites like the Eagle's Nest reflects a parallel, still ongoing process of reckoning with the physical and architectural legacy of the regime those leaders once served. Both processes remain, in their own ways, unfinished. New historical research continues to reshape scholarly understanding of exactly what happened at sites like Obersalzberg, just as new generations of legal scholars continue to study and debate the precedents established at Nuremberg, a reminder that even 80 years after the war's end, the work of fully understanding and appropriately memorializing the Nazi era remains very much a living, evolving project rather than a settled, closed chapter of history. In the end, perhaps the most fitting way to understand the Eagle's Nest is not as a monument in the traditional sense at all, celebratory or otherwise, but simply as a survivor, a structure that has outlasted the empire it was built to glorify by a margin of decades that continues to grow with every passing year. It survived the war that its builders helped unleash. It survived the deliberate post-war campaign to erase the physical traces of Nazi power from the Bavarian landscape. It has survived so far the passage of enough time that direct living memory of the regime that built it is rapidly disappearing, leaving its ongoing interpretation entirely in the hands of historians, educators, and tourism officials working from the historical record rather than personal experience. Whatever one makes of the decision to preserve it, to operate it as a restaurant, to send tour buses up the same road forced labourers once carved from the mountainside, the building itself simply endures, a silent, weathered witness perched at the summit of the Kehlstein, indifferent to the debates that continue to swirl around its proper meaning, waiting each spring for the snow to melt and the next season of visitors to arrive. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this journey through the strange afterlife of Hitler's mountain retreat as fascinating as we did. If you enjoyed learning about the fate of this extraordinary and unsettling piece of Nazi architecture, make sure to check out our video on where the Waffen-SS went after 1945, which traces the post-war fates of the men who once guarded sites just like this one across the collapsing Third Reich. You might also want to watch our video on what happened to Germany's field marshals after World War II, which follows the men who commanded Hitler's armies from the battlefield all the way to the courtroom, and in some cases, to the gallows. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload covering the people, places, and machines of World War II. See you in the next one. The comparison to other surviving Hitler sites becomes even more striking when one considers the fate of the house where Hitler was actually born. A modest building in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, just across the border from Bavaria. Unlike the Eagle's Nest, this building had no direct connection to Nazi crimes or wartime decision-making, Hitler's family having moved away when he was still an infant, and yet the structure has proven, if anything, even more difficult for Austrian authorities to manage than Obersalzberg proved for their Bavarian counterparts. For decades, the building was leased by the Austrian government specifically to prevent it from being used as a neo-Nazi shrine, with successive governments paying rent to keep the property out of circulation and largely inaccessible to the public. Periodic proposals to demolish the house entirely have surfaced over the years, with critics arguing that a building where Hitler spent only the earliest, most forgettable months of his infancy carries far less genuine historical significance than sites like the Wannsee Villa in Berlin, where senior Nazi officials formally coordinated plans for the systematic murder of European Jewry, a site now preserved specifically as a memorial and museum precisely because of its direct, undeniable connection to one of history's greatest crimes. Ultimately, Austrian authorities settled on a different approach entirely, expropriating the Braunau house from its private owner in 2017 and announcing plans to repurpose the building for use by police or a charitable organization, deliberately avoiding both outright demolition and any form of commemorative preservation, opting instead for a kind of practical neutralization through mundane institutional reuse, a solution that in its own way echoes the pragmatic instincts that first saved the Eagle's Nest from destruction back in the early 1950s. The Wannsee Villa itself offers perhaps the starkest possible contrast to the Eagle's Nest in terms of how a surviving Nazi-era building has been deliberately transformed into an active instrument of historical education. It was in this elegant lakeside villa, on January 20th, 1942, that senior Nazi and SS officials gathered for a meeting chaired by Reinhard Heydrich to coordinate the logistics of what would become known as the final solution, the systematic deportation and murder of Jews across German-occupied Europe. Unlike the Eagle's Nest, which survived largely by chance and was repurposed primarily for commercial tourism, the Wannsee Villa was deliberately preserved and eventually transformed into a dedicated memorial and educational centre, opening to the public in this capacity in 1992, precisely because of the building's unambiguous, direct connection to one of the regime's most consequential and horrifying decisions. Visitors to the Wannsee House encounter an experience fundamentally different from a visit to the Eagle's Nest, an experience built entirely around historical education and moral reckoning, with no restaurant, no beer garden, and no scenic terrace views competing for the visitor's attention. This contrast illustrates just how much the specific historical function of a surviving Nazi building shapes the range of options available to those tasked with deciding its post-war fate. A building where genocide was planned demands, and generally receives, a fundamentally different treatment than a building where a paranoid dictator occasionally drank tea and stared uneasily at the mountains. Returning to the specific case of the Eagle's Nest, it is worth considering one final layer of historical irony embedded in the building's survival. Martin Bormann, the man whose relentless ambition and organizational drive brought the Kehlstein House into existence, did not live to see how his creation would eventually be remembered. In the chaos surrounding the fall of Berlin, Bormann attempted to flee the city following Hitler's suicide, and for decades afterward, his ultimate fate remained a subject of intense speculation. with some believing he had successfully escaped to South America alongside other fleeing Nazi officials, joining a wave of post-war flight that saw figures like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele evade capture for years or even decades. It was not until 1972 that construction workers in Berlin discovered skeletal remains near the site of the former Lehrter Bahnhof railway station, remains that forensic analysis would eventually confirm and later DNA testing in 1998 would definitively establish belonged to Bormann himself, indicating he had died attempting to escape the city in early May 1945, likely by his own hand or possibly killed during the chaotic fighting, rather than escaping to enjoy a comfortable post-war exile, as had long been rumoured. The man who built the Eagle's Nest as a monument to eternal Nazi glory died, in the end, a fugitive in the rubble of his own collapsing capital, his body left unidentified and largely forgotten for nearly 3 decades, a fate that stands in almost poetic contrast to the mountain retreat he left behind, which today welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, considerably more attention and foot traffic than Bormann himself ever received during his lifetime of scheming behind the scenes of Hitler's inner circle. Eva Braun, whose sunbathing and hiking excursions at the Eagle's Nest represent some of the building's most enduring images from its brief period of active wartime use, met her own end just days after that final Bormann disappearance, having married Hitler in a brief ceremony inside the Berlin bunker on April 29, 1945, and then joining him in a joint suicide the following day, April 30th. Her sister Gretel, whose wedding reception at the Eagle's Nest in June 1944 had provided one of the building's last moments of genuine celebration before the war's final catastrophic collapse, survived the war and lived for decades afterward, raising the daughter she had conceived with the executed Hermann Fegelein. A quiet post-war existence that stood in marked contrast to the violent ends met by so many others who had once gathered on the terrace of her sister's mountain retreat. These interconnected stories of Bormann's fugitive death and belated identification, of Eva Braun's final days in the Berlin bunker, of Gretel Fegelein's quiet survival, of Göring's capture and eventual suicide at Nuremberg, all trace back in some fashion to the small chalet on the Kehlstein summit, a building that briefly hosted this entire cast of historical figures during moments of celebration and relative normalcy before the full catastrophe of the war's final year swept them toward radically different fates. The Eagle's Nest stands today as a kind of physical witness to all of these interconnected stories, a structure that outlived nearly everyone who once walked its halls, outlived the regime that built it, and outlived even the deliberate attempts made by both Allied bombers and Bavarian demolition crews to erase the physical legacy of Hitler's mountain domain.